December 1610. The torches cast shadows across frozen stone as armed men surrounded Chachtice Castle. They had ridden through the night on orders from the king himself. Count György Thurzo raised his hand. The doors were forced open. Inside, the halls were silent, except for the sound of boots on cold floors. They moved through corridors that smelled of rot and iron. Then they reached the locked chamber. When they broke through, they found a young servant girl. Her pulse was fading, skin drained of color. The floor beneath her was still warm, slick with blood that hadn't yet congealed. The air was thick with the smell of copper and something else, fear, recent and sharp. Whatever had been done to her had ended minutes ago, maybe less. Someone was still here. They could feel it. The castle did not feel empty. Was she watching them already? The guards pressed deeper, weapons drawn, expecting resistance. More rooms, more evidence, and standing in the center of it all, composed, almost serene, was Countess Elizabeth Báthory. She did not run, she did not plead. She simply looked at them as if they had interrupted something private, as if they were the intruders. But what they were about to uncover would become one of the darkest legends in European history. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in Hungary. The Báthorys weren't just nobility, they were kingmakers. Her uncle was the Prince of Transylvania. Another relative became King of Poland. This was a family that shaped empires, but it was also a family that had folded in on itself. Generations of intermarriage to consolidate power had left genetic traces: epilepsy, violent outbursts, instability. Elizabeth herself allegedly suffered seizures as a child, though whether this was medical fact or later embellishment remains unclear. What is clear is that she grew up in profound isolation, surrounded by power but not warmth. Public executions were civic events. Torture was legal procedure. She watched these things from an early age, not hidden away but present, observing. She learned early that pain was normal, that empathy was optional. In her world, power replaced tenderness. Cruelty wasn't hidden, it was governance. At 15, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier known for his brutality against the Ottomans. He was called the Black Knight. Their marriage united two of Hungary's most influential houses. Ferenc spent most of their marriage at war, leaving Elizabeth to manage vast estates, dozens of castles, and hundreds of servants. She was educated, intelligent, fluent in multiple languages. She ran an empire while her husband was gone. And in those empty halls, something began to shift. But the real transformation didn't begin in the ballroom. It began in the silence of the castle. The first disappearances were easy to explain. Servant girls ran away. They got sick. They were sent to other estates. In a world where peasants had no rights and noble authority was absolute, no one questioned it. But the pattern became harder to ignore. Young women would arrive at Chachtice Castle seeking work. They would enter through the gates, and they would never leave. The punishments Elizabeth inflicted started as discipline: a slap for slowness, a beating for disobedience. Nothing unusual for the time, but then it evolved. The punishments became longer, more elaborate. Girls were stripped and left outside in winter, not for an hour, but for a night. Water was poured over them slowly, methodically, until ice formed on their skin. Others were burned with heated irons in patterns, as if testing thresholds. Witnesses later testified that Elizabeth watched with cold fascination, noting reactions, measuring limits. She was not just punishing them, she was studying something. It became a form of control that fed itself. Each act required something more to produce the same effect. Control, like any drug, builds tolerance. And like any addiction, it demands escalation. The power wasn't in the pain. It was in the absolute authority to inflict it without consequence. And behind the castle walls, the pattern deepened. Rumors began to spread through the villages. Families stopped sending their daughters. But Elizabeth had power, land, and protection. Complaints went nowhere. At first, it was discipline. Then it became something else. The most famous story about Elizabeth Báthory is the one that defines her: that she bathed in the blood of young virgins to preserve her youth, that she believed blood could reverse aging, keep her skin pale and perfect. The image is grotesque, unforgettable. It's repeated in every retelling. But here's the problem. There's no evidence she ever did it. The blood-bathing legend doesn't appear in any of the original testimonies from her trial. It wasn't mentioned by the investigators. It wasn't written down until more than 100 years after her death, appearing first in a Jesuit scholar's work in the 1720s. By then, Elizabeth had become myth more than memory. So where did it come from? Some historians believe it was propaganda. Elizabeth was a Protestant in a Catholic kingdom during the Counter-Reformation, when religious identity could justify seizure and execution. More critically, King Matthias owed the Báthory family a staggering debt, 17,000 Hungarian gold florins, a sum that could bankrupt the royal treasury. Seizing her lands and destroying her reputation solved both problems at once. A dead countess settles a debt. A living one does not. What if she was useful as a monster? Others argue the testimonies, gathered under torture from terrified servants, were designed to justify what had already been decided. Over 300 witnesses were called. The numbers kept growing. 30 victims, then 80, then 650. 650 bodies. In a region where people noticed when a single girl went missing. Where were they buried? How did no one see? The blood legend is compelling because it gives motive to madness. But what if the madness itself was the legend? They killed her servants, but they did not kill the legend. In December 1610, Count Thurzo arrived at Čachtice Castle with armed men and royal authority. What they found was enough to justify immediate action. Several young women, dead or dying, testimony from terrified servants, evidence of prolonged cruelty. Elizabeth's 4 closest associates, the ones accused of helping her, were arrested immediately. They were tried in 1611. 3 were executed. 1 had her fingers torn out before being burned alive. But Elizabeth herself was never formally charged. She was never put on trial. There was no public hearing, no legal process. Some say this was mercy because of her family's status. Others believe it was strategy. A trial would have been a spectacle. It would have exposed the king's debts. It would have risked destabilizing the most powerful noble house in Hungary during a time of war with the Ottomans. Instead, they made her disappear, not through execution, through something quieter, something crueler. Elizabeth Báthory was sealed inside her own castle. Masons bricked up the windows and doors of her chambers, leaving only a small slot for food and waste. She could not see outside. She could not speak to anyone. 4 walls, darkness, silence. For a woman who once controlled hundreds of lives, who dictated fates with a gesture, the silence may have been the cruelest punishment. The woman who once filled halls with screams now heard nothing but her own. No servants to command, no voices to hear, just stone and her own breath. Days blurred into months, months into years. There was nothing to count but meals pushed through a slot. Nothing to mark time but the slow erosion of self. 4 years passed this way. In 1614, a guard looked through the food slot and saw her lying on the floor. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, was dead at 54. There was no announcement, no funeral, no grave marker. Her body was buried quietly, possibly at the family estate in Exed, though records are unclear. Later, even that became uncertain. Some say the body was moved. Some say it was lost during the chaos of wars that followed. During World War II, many Hungarian archives were destroyed. The physical evidence, if it ever existed, is gone. But the myth didn't need a grave. It fed on absence. What remains is the question no one can fully answer. Was Elizabeth Báthory a sadistic killer who murdered dozens, perhaps hundreds, of young women? Or was she a powerful woman destroyed by men who needed her wealth and feared her influence? The truth is probably darker than either extreme. She almost certainly committed acts of violence. The testimonies, even accounting for exaggeration and torture, are too consistent. But the scale, the bloodbaths, the 600 victims that feels like myth, built on fragments of truth. What's undeniable is this: Elizabeth had absolute power over the people in her care, and she used it without restraint. In a world where cruelty was normal, hers became exceptional. And when she finally fell, the story that survived wasn't about justice, it was about horror. Because horror is what people remember. Her name has outlasted kings. It has survived wars, regime changes, and centuries of retelling. She appears in films, novels, and folklore as the eternal symbol of female monstrosity. But perhaps the real horror isn't what she did. It's what we made her into. a cautionary tale, a fantasy, a way to contain the uncomfortable truth that cruelty doesn't need a reason. It only needs opportunity. History doesn't remember her because she was uniquely evil. It remembers her because she was possible. Because in the right circumstances, with the right combination of power and isolation, anyone could become unrecognizable. That's the legend we can't escape. Not the blood, the mirror. And that is far more disturbing than any vampire story. Some rulers build empires. Some build fear. But only a few build legends so dark that even history hesitates to tell them. Elizabeth Báthory became one of those legends. Not because of what we know, but because of what we can never unlearn. The castle still stands in Slovakia. The rooms are empty now. But the question it raises is not,